Since the last time I stood before you behind this sacred desk, the state of the nation and of the world has taken a decidedly pessimistic turn. Now, you probably say, Pastor, don't be that conceited. It's been bad all along. That is true. But since the last time I stood before you, there have been 3 mass shootings in the United States, killing, and maiming, and injuring people who were just going about their lives expecting to be safe. And that's on top of our regular gun deaths throughout the United States. And in response, there have been cowardly leaders unwilling and unable to take action to make us safer. They rely on prayers, and I'm a believer in prayer. But leadership requires something else. Since then, economists and corporate analysts have been warning of an impending recession as the nations engage in a trade war and as tax cuts are given to the most privileged and wealthy of people without regard for the impact on the most economically vulnerable. Since then, the Amazon rainforest, which is home to 10% of the Earth's known species, 1,500 species of bird, 40,000 species of plants, and which is known as the lungs of the planet because it produces 20% of the world's oxygen, is ablaze, with fires destroying wildlife and plant life at a faster rate than any time in its history. Since then, 4 more trans women of color have been viciously murdered in the United States, and the cultural and religious silence is deafening and infuriating. Yes, we are more divided than ever before, and racism and sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and poverty continue to plague our body politic. The shape of things is not good. And as I wrestle with how to respond to the shape of things, I have a deeper appreciation for the biblical prophets. You see, prophets do not have the luxury of looking the other way. Me, in my privileged life, I can put on Netflix and chill and block it all out. I can surround myself with my other privileged friends, and we can tell jokes and enjoy. So just block it all out. But prophets can't do that. They do not have the luxury of looking the other way. They must confront the world as it is and name what is happening. They are called by God to tell the truth about the way things are. And in speaking to, for, and about God, prophets cannot pick and choose what they will care about. See, I told you, I can choose some days to block it out. We can choose some days. But prophets can't do it. They cannot choose what they will care about. They just have to tell the people what they see and tell the people what God cares about. Prophets are not satisfied with giving speeches or singing songs about patriotism and nationalism. Oh, they cannot be cheerleaders for the nation. They may want to, but they are compelled to tell the truth. They cannot soothe their guilt or their anxiety with the myths that nations tell themselves about their heroism and their goodness and their exceptionalism. Boy, try as they might, they can't do it. And the prophet Jeremiah finds himself in just such a position in looking at the shape of things in Israel. Sometimes Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet. He cries, partly because he doesn't want to do the job. But prophets have no choice. Even before he was born, God chose Jeremiah and gave him a word to speak to the nations and the kingdoms, to pluck up and pluck down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. And Jeremiah's task was to speak the governing word of God over against Israel's royal consciousness and her self-deception. You see, Israel had become convinced of her own blessedness. How does that sound to you? Have you seen a nation like that? Convinced of her blessedness. We're in covenant relationship with God. Nothing's going to happen to us. God chose us. How on earth will God do so poorly to the people God chose? She began to rely on her human wisdom and human strength for her future. Israel became guilty of amassing wealth unjustly. Who does that sound like? I'm going to get in trouble too, but see, I'm going home after this. She was guilty of amassing wealth unjustly. The land of promise was made desolate by the people's abuse and exploitation. And as Jeremiah himself declared in echoing God's complaint about Israel, they did not obey or incline their ear, but in the stubbornness of their evil will, they walked in their own counsels, and they looked backward rather than forward. Oh, Israel looked backward rather than forward. Make Israel great again. They look backward rather than forward. And like a good mediator, Jeremiah appeals to God for deliverance for Israel. Forgive her, God. Don't show your wrath toward her, God. That was Jeremiah's appeal to God. And when he prays for hope and healing, God sends Jeremiah to the potter's house. You see, God wants Jeremiah to see in the actions of a potter signs and symbols of God's own posture toward Israel. And the image that Jeremiah sees is God as an artist, and I think that is very intentional. We have all kinds of images of God. God is a king. God is a great warrior. But in this case, God is an artist, a shaper of nations and peoples. God gets God's hands messy, touching. God is intimate. God is not distant. No, God is right there, holding God's creation in God's hands. And so Jeremiah sees something a little bit new in what God is and what God seeks to be. And yet the image is not reassuring. For God declares God's sovereignty not only to build and plan for what is good for nations, which we expect from a loving God, but also God's freedom to shape evil and design a plan against the people. That is a disturbing image. That God would be designing something evil. That is a disturbing image because it speaks to our fear that God may be orchestrating against us when life goes wrong, when the shape of things are not as good. We've all had powerful religious figures using this image of God to control and frighten us. But even as we wonder about this frightening image of God's wrath, there is also a hopeful message in God's response to Jeremiah. For in this role as an artist, in this role as a potter, in this role as a shaper of things, we see a God who is willing to be changed. Oh, you didn't hear what I said. God is willing to reconsider God's plans. Oh, you still didn't hear me, all God's children. Let me say it a different way. God is willing to begin anew when God's people have recommitted themselves to God's ways. In other words, God is not fixed. I know we've been told, oh, God doesn't change. God is the same. God doesn't change. But God says in this image of the potter, God is not rigid and God's plan is not fixed. God can be ministered to. Oh, you all are so quiet. I'll try to explain to you. God can be influenced. So when you are praying, God can be ministered to by little old you in the Twin Cities. God can be influenced. Israel can avoid destruction if she turns back to God. The people can change the shape of things if they allow themselves to be shaped by God's hands again. And since God is willing to reshape the world, I wonder why it is we so easily adjust to a misshapen world. Oh, I said something then, you didn't catch it, but that's okay. Why do we adjust to how horrible it is? Is it because we become so comfortable in our privilege and in our power? You know, even as the shape of things continue to deteriorate, pundits, politicians, columnists, and even some religious folk tell us that our democracy and our institutions remain strong and steady. We are told that even as things take a bad turn, we just need to double down on doing what we've always done. That our best hope is in maintaining the status quo. We are told that we are an exceptional nation, that the racism and the inequality and the violence and the poverty in our nation are just bugs rather than a feature of our nation. Why do we adjust when God is willing to be convinced to reshape the whole world? Why do we accept it when God says, I'll change my mind and make it good for you if you turn back to me? It seems to be lost on far too many people that perhaps the shape of things now are a result of our failure to respond to God's loving touch. Perhaps the shape we are in is because we have not let ourselves be transformed by God's love and grace. Perhaps we have been given over to our worst instincts because we have resisted God's desire and attempt to mold us into something good and lasting and beautiful. Unless we think we still have time to do better, we must face the truth that we have in too many cases simply run out of time. We've run out of time in so many cases. Dead infant and toddler asylum seekers at the southern border. The lives taken by gunmen with assault rifles. Dead animal and plant species in the Amazon rainforest are indications that we have run out of time. They're gone. The shape of things are not good. Those are the horrible costs of our refusal to be shaped by God's loving hands. Now, before anybody out there protests that this preacher is blaming us for this mess, I invite us all to simply look at how we are showing up in the moment. Are we responding as clay to the divine potter's touch, or are we resisting what is good and lasting and beautiful in the midst of this cruel, divisive world? Are we being shaped? Are we being shaped by God, or are we being shaped by something else? We, the people who gather in the name of God, who call ourselves followers of the way of Jesus Christ, have been shown a better way. We've been shown how it can be. We've been shown what the good news is. And yet, we resist the potter's hands. We resist the loving touch. We resist the sovereignty of God to shape us into some. We've allowed ourselves to be shaped by a whole host of things. I can name them. We've allowed ourselves to be shaped by the Republican Party. We've allowed the Democratic Party to shape us. We've allowed our ideologies to shape us. We've allowed being white to shape us. We've allowed being black to shape us. We've allowed being trans to shape us. We've allowed being gay to shape us. We've allowed being in Minnesota to shape us. We've allowed living in the North to shape us. We've allowed being in the South to shape us. We've allowed being in recovery to shape us. When are we going to let God shape us? When are we going to let God shape us? When are we going to allow that potter to shape who and what we are? And here's the good news. Here's the good news. All those other things can shape you. That's fine. But here's the good news. The shape of things now can be reshaped. You've probably heard it many times, but it doesn't have to be this way. I know old pastor is an old dreamer. I know y'all say that behind my back. But it doesn't have to be this way. And we don't have to do this on our own. We can trust God again. God is open to being changed if we are willing to be changed. We can allow God to shape us. God is an artist. Oh, I'm going to hold on to that one. That's an image I don't use enough of, but God is an artist. A master of the craft of creation, full of love, hope, grace, and imagination. That divine artist is willing to do something about the troubling shape of the world. And we don't have to give in to the influence of the nation or the influences of politicians or the influence of our ideologies. Our fate is not sealed. It's not. God's plans are not fixed. No matter what anybody tells you, God's plans are not fixed. We can do better. We can respond to God's promptings and God's loving attempts to make and mold us. But by being shaped by God, here's the wonderful thing to remember. We get to minister to God. We get to testify to God with our lives. We get to show God what it means to be a loving, good neighbor. To love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, our neighbor as ourselves. We get to follow the command that Jesus gave. I command you to love one another. Oh, and just like we clap our hands and shout when we hear the good news, I can see it very bleakly. I can see it. It's cloudy. But I can see God stepping up to the clay and making something even more wonderful. Something that we never imagined. May it be so. Amen.